Forensic criminology teaches us that the first hours decide the tone of everything that follows. That single exchange between John Ramsey and Officer French, defensive charged human, became more than a moment. It became evidence of how communication breaks before collaboration can begin. What started as emotional reflex quickly became investigative friction. From here, we'll look at how that first misunderstanding rippled outward, shaping perception, bias, and even the architecture of the investigation itself. Because in a case like this, it's not just what was said that matters, it's how it was heard. Theme 2: The First Fracture, When Common Sense Becomes Confrontation. Let's shift to another angle here, one that gets at something we often overlook when analyzing this case. The very first interaction between John Ramsey and law enforcement. When Officer Rick French asked John whether JonBenet might have run away, John's immediate response was defensive and dismissive. "She's 6 years old. My God, why would a 6-year-old run away?" This exchange, seemingly minor, actually reveals a fundamental fracture in the investigation that would never heal. From a logical perspective, Officer French was doing exactly what training dictates, establishing baseline information by eliminating the most common scenarios first. Children do sometimes wander off. Children do sometimes attempt to run away, even at young ages. The question wasn't an accusation, it was a checkbox. But John's response reframed it as an intellectual insult, a failure of good Southern common sense, as the tone suggests. This moment carries philosophical weight that extends far beyond the immediate interaction. What we're witnessing is a collision between two epistemological frameworks: the investigative framework, which must consider all possibilities systematically without prejudice, and the parental framework, which operates from intimate knowledge and emotional certainty. John knew his daughter. He knew her routines, her fears, her capacities. The question of running away wasn't just wrong, it was absurd, almost offensive in its failure to understand who JonBenet was. But that intimate knowledge, however accurate, can't substitute for procedural thoroughness. The philosophical tension here is between particular knowledge and universal method. Both are valid in their domains, but they're fundamentally incompatible in the moment of crisis. John's frustration represents the collision of these incompatible ways of knowing. Psychologically, this exchange reveals layers of cognitive dissonance and threat perception that would characterize the entire investigation. John was operating from a place of absolute terror. His daughter was missing, the circumstances were bizarre, and time was critical. In that state, any question that didn't immediately advance toward finding her felt like obstruction or stupidity. This is loss aversion psychology intensified to an extreme degree. Every second spent on irrelevant questions felt like seconds stolen from saving JonBenet. The psychological literature on crisis decision-making shows that people in acute distress often become rigidly focused on their own mental model of the situation, rejecting information or procedures that don't align with that model. This isn't deception, it's cognitive narrowing under extreme stress. John's dismissive response reflects a mind that had already concluded certain possibilities were impossible and resented having to waste precious time on them. From a physiological standpoint, we're looking at someone in fight or flight mode being asked to engage in calm, systematic problem solving. John's body was flooded with stress hormones, his heart rate was likely elevated, his breathing shallow, his perception narrowed. When in this state, the brain literally cannot process information the same way it does under normal conditions. The question about running away would have been heard not through the filter of rational consideration, but through the filter of acute threat response. Every question that wasn't "Where is my daughter?" would register as a threat, a delay, a distraction, a failure to understand the urgency. The sharp tone in John's response isn't necessarily revealing of guilt or innocence, it's revealing of a nervous system in crisis mode. This matters because it establishes a pattern where normal investigative procedure would feel like attack, creating an escalating cycle of defensiveness. Forensic criminology teaches us that the first hours of an investigation set the tone for everything that follows, and this exchange contaminated that crucial foundation. When a subject immediately pushes back against standard questions, investigators note it not necessarily as evidence of guilt, but as a behavioral marker requiring attention. The problem is that both innocent and guilty parties can have reasons for this defensiveness. An innocent person might be frustrated by what they perceive as time wasting. A guilty person might be attempting to redirect focus away from uncomfortable areas. The forensic challenge is that the behavior itself doesn't reliably distinguish between these possibilities. What it does do, however, is create investigative friction. Officer French would have noted John's defensiveness. Other officers would have been briefed on it. A narrative would begin forming. Father is resistant to basic questions that would influence subsequent interactions. This is how investigations develop tunnel vision, not through malice, but through cumulative pattern recognition that may or may not be accurately interpreted. The anthropological dimension here is crucial for understanding why this exchange went sideways so quickly. The Ramseys inhabited a particular socioeconomic and cultural space where their authority and judgment were typically deferred to, not questioned. John was a successful CEO, accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, the one whose assessments carried weight. The cultural script he operated from positioned him as expert on his own family and situation. When Officer French, likely younger and less economically powerful, asked a question that seemed elementary or misguided, it violated John's cultural expectations of how interactions should flow. This isn't about John being arrogant. It's about cultural conditioning that shapes how people expect to be treated by institutions. In John's cultural framework, his judgment about whether his daughter would run away should have been immediately accepted, not double-checked. The question itself represented a subtle status challenge that his cultural programming registered as inappropriate. If we consider the criminal mindset perspective, again, analytically rather than accusatorily, this exchange reveals something significant. A person responsible for harm would need to immediately establish control over how the situation is understood and investigated. Shutting down lines of inquiry that don't fit the preferred narrative becomes essential. A sharp dismissal of the runaway question accomplishes multiple things. It establishes John as the authority on what makes sense. It creates social pressure for investigators to defer to his judgment. It narrows the investigative focus toward the narrative of outside abduction. Whether this was conscious strategy or unconscious defensiveness, the effect is identical. It trains investigators to anticipate resistance when pursuing certain lines of questioning, which can cause them to avoid those lines, or conversely, to become more suspicious about why those lines are being blocked. Either way, the person responsible benefits from the confusion and misdirection these early confrontations create. This brings us to a deeper question about the investigation's trajectory. At what point does legitimate frustration with procedure become obstruction of justice? John believed, probably sincerely, that Officer French was wasting time on absurd questions. But from the investigative side, establishing basic facts isn't time wasting, it's the foundation everything else builds on. The tragedy here is that both perspectives have validity, but they're mutually exclusive in practice. John needed investigators to trust his knowledge and move with urgency toward his theory of what happened. Investigators needed to follow protocol without prejudice to any particular theory. These needs couldn't both be met. The result was escalating frustration on both sides, John feeling dismissed and obstructed, investigators feeling resisted and manipulated. This dynamic, established in the first hour, would define the entire investigation. Every subsequent interaction would be filtered through this mutual distrust, making genuine cooperation increasingly impossible. And that impossibility, regardless of who bore primary responsibility for it, may have cost this case any chance at resolution. Theme 3, the cascading failure of mutual understanding. So when we really sit with this and think through the implications, what emerges is a pattern that extends far beyond a single uncomfortable question. The interaction between John and Officer French over the runaway question was just the opening movement in what became a symphony of miscommunication and mistrust. From a logical perspective, what we're observing is a cascading failure of investigative rapport building. Each subsequent question would be colored by the first interaction. If Officer French felt dismissed or disrespected, he would approach the next question differently, perhaps more formally, more carefully, which John might interpret as coldness or suspicion. If John felt his judgment was being questioned inappropriately, he would approach the next question more defensively, which French might interpret as evasiveness or hostility. This is how investigations go off the rails, not through anyone's explicit malice, but through compounding misunderstandings that create self-reinforcing patterns of dysfunction. Philosophically, this reflects a deeper truth about human communication in crisis, that interpretation is always subjective and always influenced by context, expectation, and emotional state. Officer French interpreted the runaway question as routine procedure. John interpreted it as insulting and time wasting. Both interpretations are true within their respective frameworks, yet they're incompatible. This philosophical problem that multiple contradictory truths can coexist plagues this entire case. The Ramseys believed they were cooperating. Investigators believed the Ramseys were obstructing. The Ramseys believed they were being persecuted. Investigators believed they were following evidence. These aren't lies on either side. They're genuine perceptions shaped by different vantage points and different stakes. The philosophical challenge is that justice requires some shared understanding of truth, yet truth itself proves unstable when viewed through different experiential lenses. The psychological dynamics of this breakdown reveal how trauma distorts communication in ways that create additional trauma. John was operating from a place of terror and desperation. His daughter was missing, circumstances were bizarre, and nothing made sense. In that psychological state, anything that didn't immediately align with finding JonBenét would register as threat or obstruction. This is cognitive narrowing taken to an extreme. The psychological literature on trauma shows that people in acute distress lose access to their full cognitive and emotional range. They can't engage in nuanced reasoning or see multiple perspectives simultaneously. Everything becomes binary, helpful or harmful, ally or enemy. Officer French's question, intended as routine, was psychologically processed by John as harmful, and therefore French was categorized as potentially enemy. Once that categorization occurred, everything French did subsequently would be interpreted through that filter. This is how innocent procedural questions become evidence of persecution in the traumatized mind. Physiologically, we have to consider what days of acute stress due to the human system and how that affected every interaction the Ramseys had with law enforcement. Sleep deprivation, sustained cortisol elevation, and the physical toll of grief combine to create profound cognitive impairment. Studies show that after even 24 hours of acute stress, people's ability to accurately interpret social cues, control emotional reactions, and engage in rational problem solving drops dramatically. By the time the Ramseys were being asked to come to the station on Friday evening, days into this nightmare, they were likely cognitively functioning at a significantly impaired level. John's statement that they could barely hold a conversation isn't dramatization, it's probably physiological reality. In that state, requests that might seem reasonable to rested, calm investigators would feel impossible and aggressive, This physiological dimension doesn't excuse potential obstruction, but it does complicate our interpretation of it. How much of the Ramses' resistance was strategic calculation versus trauma-induced inability to function according to standard expectations? From a forensic criminology perspective, what's striking about this early breakdown is how completely it undermined the most valuable tool in any investigation: voluntary cooperation and information flow. The vast majority of crimes are solved not through brilliant deduction, but through people talking, through relationships that allow information to surface naturally. When that relationship is poisoned from the start, whether through investigator error, subject defensiveness, or mutual misunderstanding, the case immediately becomes exponentially harder to solve. Forensically, the Ramses pattern of limited cooperation, while legally they're right, created an environment where the normal mechanisms of truth discovery couldn't function. But here's the crucial point: both innocent and guilty parties can have legitimate reasons for limiting cooperation once trust is broken. An innocent person who believes investigators are biased against them has every reason to avoid uncontrolled interactions that might be twisted against them. A guilty person obviously has reason to limit exposure. The behavior pattern doesn't distinguish between these possibilities, which is precisely what makes this case so intractable. The anthropological context of this breakdown reveals class and cultural dimensions that often go unexamined. The Ramseys came from a social stratum where interactions with law enforcement were typically either non existent or deferential. They had no cultural framework for being treated as suspects rather than victims. This created a profound dissonance that amplified every negative interaction. In their cultural world, when crisis struck, institutions existed to serve and protect them. The shift to being investigated rather than served represented not just a change in circumstance, but a fundamental violation of their understood social order. This anthropological perspective helps explain the intensity of their sense of persecution. It wasn't just about the specific questions or requests, it was about the shattering of fundamental assumptions about their place in the social hierarchy. Meanwhile, investigators may have brought their own class based assumptions to the table, perhaps interpreting the Ramses' wealth and lawyers as indicators of manipulation rather than standard practice within that socioeconomic sphere. Looking through the lens of criminal mindset, we have to ask what someone responsible for harm would need to accomplish in these early interactions, and whether the Ramses' behavior fits that pattern. A perpetrator would need to control information flow, establish alternative narratives, create permission for resisting intensive questioning, and sow confusion about what actually happened. The early confrontational stance accomplishes all of this, but again, so does legitimate trauma driven defensiveness. The challenge in applying criminal mindset analysis here is that the adaptive strategies for managing guilt and managing trauma while innocent are often behaviorally identical. Both require managing perception, both benefit from limiting spontaneous disclosure, both necessitate creating supportive narratives that explain resistance. The criminal mindset lens doesn't give us a clear answer, it gives us a framework for asking better questions about motivation and calculation. What haunts me about this entire dynamic is how it reflects the fundamental fragility of justice systems built on human interaction. We want to believe that truth will emerge through systematic investigation, that guilty parties will reveal themselves through behavioral inconsistencies, that innocent parties will be vindicated through cooperation and transparency. But what this case demonstrates is that trauma, cultural mismatch, systemic dysfunction, and simple miscommunication can completely short circuit these assumptions. The breakdown between the Ramseys and law enforcement began within hours and never recovered. Whether that breakdown primarily reflects the Ramseys' guilt, investigative incompetence, mutual misunderstanding, or some combination thereof remains the central unanswerable question. What's clear is that once the spiral began, it became self perpetuating, each side's behavior confirming the other's worst assumptions, creating a feedback loop that made truth discovery increasingly impossible. And in that impossibility, justice for JonBenet became another casualty. We've explored the linguistic architecture, the initial fractures, and the cascading failures that characterize those first critical hours and days. These patterns tell us something profound about human behavior under impossible pressure, something that complicates our search for simple answers. Next time, we'll move deeper into the specific evidence conflicts, examining how the Ramseys navigated forensic contradictions and what their strategies of explanation reveal about control, certainty, and the malleability of truth itself. Thanks for following along on this journey through one of the most psychologically complex cases in American criminal history,